New Zealand, and welcome to another episode of Rick and Roll. My name is Mark Pacey. I am going to be your host for the next half an hour. We're going to go through again 4 more shipwreck stories. And today we start with Matira 2. Brothers David and Robert Symes set out from Castle Point at 3 p.m. on the 14th of September 1966 on board the 28-foot Wellington registered trawler Matira 2, in which David had a major share. He had 15 years' experience as a fisherman and had been crayfishing full-time for 2. This was meant to be a straightforward trip to see if they had any crays in their pots in the area south of Castle Point, but it did not go to plan. About 15 kilometres from Castle Point and 800 metres offshore, they were motoring to one of the craypot buoys when the engines stalled. The swells were pushing Matira 2 around, even after they dropped anchor. The engine remained obstinate and refused to restart, and the Syme brothers found themselves in a bit of a predicament. A large wave then crashed over Matira 2, and she tipped end over end in the surf. Robert was thrown into the sea when the trawler turned over, surfacing alongside. His brother David was nowhere to be seen. Underneath the overturned Matira, David was in trouble. Pinned against rocks, he was also entangled in netting and ropes. Desperate, he finally found a rope that he knew was attached to a wheel on the side of the vessel and pulled himself along it. Having spent over a minute under the stricken vessel, David finally surfaced. "I was pretty worried. I didn't think I was going to get out," he later recalled. Floating alongside the capsized Matira 2, the 2 brothers started the swim to shore, still several hundred metres away. Reaching the beach, they watched as the Matira 2 followed them in, struck a rock, and came to rest, still upside down. They then began the long walk to Castle Point to rest. Despite all they had been through, their only injuries were minor cuts, a miracle considering how the scenario could have played out. David was undeterred by the event. Despite the loss of his vessel and a near-drowning experience, he still had a strong love for the sea. He told the Wairarapa Times-Age that he planned to acquire another boat and get out again as soon as possible. The Matira 2 was beyond saving. The vessel's engine, a Chrysler Marine model with a value of £200, and the gearbox were both recovered from the wreck. The cabin had been torn off and was lying 90 metres from the main wreck. The hull of Matira 2 had a broken back and one side smashed in. Questions were then raised about maritime safety and if the Syme brothers had done all they could during their time of crisis. The authorities said that all vessels should have life jackets and flares on board as well as a good radio. The authorities had clearly not understood the speed at which the Matira 2 accident had happened. The Matira 2 did have 2 good walkie-talkies, although one was unmasted and getting repaired. Both brothers were wearing life jackets, but they had been unable to find any flares to purchase before they headed out. The sea can change in a heartbeat, as the Syme brothers discovered, and in some cases having safety equipment would make no difference to the outcome. David summed it up perfectly. Neither flares nor radio would have helped this time because the capsize happened too fast for any help to arrive. The only thing which could have helped would have been a new motor. Nobody could have got there in time after the motor refused to restart. Time for a piece of music. This one, it's mostly ship related. A couple of weeks ago I played one about the sirens, who are these beautiful creatures that lured ships to their death. This is kind of the opposite side of that. This is about a sort of a big slimy beast that lives under the sea that could potentially pull you down. This is The Thing That Should Not Be by Metallica, and this is going out to my buddy Greg. And that was The Thing That Should Not Be by Metallica off their 1986 album Master of Puppets. That's shipwreck number 58. This is Tuvalu. The Tuvalu was a 125-ton, 120-foot Fijian freighter who spent her earlier years conducting shipping throughout the South Pacific. In January of 1967, she had been contracted to help with a United Geophysics expedition to find oil in Cook Strait. With a crew of Dutch officers and Fijian crewmen, the Tuvalu made her way to New Zealand. Journeying from Noumea, New Caledonia, she arrived at Gisborne, where she made a stopover before sailing again on the 8th of January. She was scheduled to rendezvous with the United oil vessel United Geo 1 to transfer her cargo, but she never made the meeting. Tuvalu was making her way down the coast and ran into trouble off the coast of Glenburn Station. She had sailed too close to shore and ran aground close to Honeycomb Rock. At 3 a.m, a distress call was sent out, which was picked up at marine radio stations in Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch. A hunt was launched just after 4 a.m. to find what had happened to the ship. No further messages were sent out by the Tuvalu, so the searchers did not know where the ship had run into trouble. The search was aided by 2 American helicopters, which had been launched from their icebreaker Eastwind, which was docked in Wellington. They were joined by the Straits Air Freight Express Bristol freighter and a New Zealand Air Force Sunderland flying boat. 4 hours after the search was launched, the Tuvalu was spotted by the American helicopters, who then stayed with the stricken vessel to provide what assistance they could. 7 of the crew members were successfully taken off the ship and flown by helicopter back to Wellington. The remainder of the crew elected to stay with their ship to oversee any salvage operations. After swimming to shore, they were met by local farmers and taken to Glenburn Station, where they remained until the cargo had been removed safely. The Tuvalu had been carrying detonators and a large supply of explosives. Due to the risk they posed, explosives experts had to be brought in to conduct the recovery of the cargo, which was then taken away by helicopter to Greytown, where it was kept under police guard. Marine experts were very doubtful that the Tuvalu, which was initially valued at £20,000, could be salvaged. It was decided to recover what could be saved. The remaining crew, with the help of local farmers, proceeded to remove what they could from the stranded ship. During the day, the crew removed salvageable contents and fixtures and then spent the nights at local batches and stations. As a thank you to one batch owner, the crew presented him with the Tuvalu's barometer. It still remains with the family at their batch in pristine condition. The same could not be said about the Tuvalu, which was well and truly beached on the coast. The Wairarapa Times Age stated, "Prospects of salvaging the ill-fated freighter Tuvalu, which ran aground at Honeycomb Rock on the Wairarapa coast early yesterday, do not look very bright." A fisherman from Glenburn offered his opinion on the beached vessel, which was also very gloomy. Nearly everything aboard the ship seems to be in a bad state of repair, although much of it has been newly painted. As to the equipment, I doubt very much it would be worth very much to salvage, because most of it is nearly worn out. In my opinion, the freighter will never be refloated again. These pessimistic opinions turned out to be accurate. The Tuvalu never left the coast. She was easily recognisable after her stranding, and was something of a landmark on the shoreline and a popular subject for photographers. She was visited by tourists, and even school trips were arranged to go and see her remains. But as the years progressed, she looked less and less like a ship. 5 decades later, a few rusted segments are all that remain. So for those of you that actually do know the shipwreck book I did, that's the ship that's actually on the cover. Right, straight into it. 59, this is Mizpah. Mizpah was a 42-foot fishing vessel which weighed 6 tons. She had been based in Wellington and was sold to a Gisborne fisherman, Mr. Healy, on the 5th of February 1968. Mizpah's previous owner, Mr. Warnes, had a crew of 4 and began the journey aboard the fishing vessel for her new home port. Shortly after leaving Wellington, the Mizpah began to experience the rough weather that is common off the coast of the Wairarapa coast. Warnes, who had years of experience in boats, was unsettled by the conditions they were travelling in. "I recently took a trip to the South Island. Although I experienced heavy seas, they were nothing compared to the sea here," he later said. As was the case with several vessels before her, the Mizpah was being driven towards the shore. Now off the coast of Castle Point, and not being able to motor further out to sea, the Mizpah dropped her anchor just outside the reef. The line snapped, so she tried again. After the third anchor line snapped, the crew knew that drastic action was needed. They sent out a radio message, but none of these got through. Even at the Whakataki Hotel, where a radio was kept on at all times, no messages were received. Despite the precarious situation the crew found themselves in, at least they knew where they were. "It was like a snowstorm coming into the shore last night. All we could see was the beam from the lighthouse and the light from the houses on the shore," Warnes recalled. They didn't have a choice. They had to beach the Mizpah. Though they had sustained some damage, they were able to bring the fishing vessel in and ground her safely on the sands. The crew got off safely and were welcomed by Castle Point locals, who had turned out on the beach with spotlights to see the sight of a beached ship. Taken to Castle Point Station, the crew were given dry clothes and warm beds for the night. The next day, the crew and some of the locals all pitched in to salvage what they could from the Mizpah. Healy was hopeful that his vessel could be saved, but he was considering the fact that the Mizpah could be a lost cause. The following week, a transporter was brought in to carry away the Mizpah. A winch on the transporter pulled the Mizpah up the beach, with 2 tractors acting as anchors. 2 cranes were also brought in to lift the vessel onto the trailer. Taking an end each, the crane slowly lifted the Mizpah from her sandy bed and onto the trailer. Just after she was laid on the trailer, some of her wooden keel collapsed and the Mizpah fell onto her side. Making the best of the situation, she was lashed down in this position. It was felt that this was better anyway, as it reduced the overall height of the transport and its special cargo. From here, the truck and its massive load began the slow trip home. After a 1-hour stopover in Masterton, the Mizpah was on her way to her new home port at Gisborne. Her new owner was keen to repair the damage and used the opportunity to upgrade her cabin at the same time. Finally, she was able to be used for the purpose that she had been purchased for. Right, and now it's time for our soundtrack piece of music. This is going back a couple of years. This is from the soundtrack of Sink the Bismarck, and it came out in 1960. This is Clifton Parker. There you go, that was the Sink the Bismarck theme from the movie of the same name. On to our last story for the day. This is Crusader. The fishing launch Crusader, valued at $5,000, set out from Rangitumo at 4 a.m. the 29th of January 1970 for a spot of fishing off the Wairarapa coast. At 9 a.m. the crew decided to head for Mataikona when they ran into a strong southerly gale. If the conditions weren't bad enough, the two crew, David Syme and Kevin Cunningham, found their vessel's motor had developed electrical problems. With the engine now dead and the seas getting worse, the Crusader's crew tried to get the engine restarted. Despite several attempts to get the vessel underway again, the engine stubbornly refused to start. And the efforts to do so drained the boat's battery, making the radio useless. Out of power and with no radio in increasingly heavy seas, things were not looking good for the Crusader and her crew. Unsure how long they would have to remain at sea to ride out the squall, they decided to drop their two anchors. The thought of drifting without any control by the rocky coast was not a risk worth taking. As darkness set in, the men prepared for an uncomfortable night at sea in the Crusader's small cabin. A moment of panic came when one of the anchor lines snapped, leaving them with just one. Syme recounted, "If the other chain had gone, we would have drifted, and I hate to think what would have happened then." The men were now overdue and had been reported as missing. As the sun rose, the community geared into action to look for the men. A search of the coastline coordinated by Master and Police Sergeant Hendrikus Bos, conducted by the police and members of the public and Land Rovers, failed to find a trace of the Crusader. An aircraft from Ohakia also joined in the search. Another aircraft, which had taken off from Hood Aerodrome, was on its way to Napier and spotted the boat 16 kilometres north of Castle Point. The pilot described the vessel as a jet boat, and there were two men in yellow wet weather gear trying to signal him. He tried to drop a note to them saying he would notify the police of their situation once he landed. Just after 7 in the morning, a jet boat belonging to Don Fenimore of Flat Point set out to try and locate the missing Crusader and her crew. The seas by this stage were very rough, and the winds were gusting nearly 50 kilometres per hour. Fenimore's jet boat fought with the conditions and finally found the Crusader. Syme and Cunningham were taken safely off their crippled vessel. By this stage, the weather had cleared enough that the Crusader could be seen from the beach. The jet boat made for the shore where Syme's tractor was waiting for them. It was Syme that then leapt ashore and climbed onto his tractor and towed Fenimore's boat out of the surf. Syme was keen to return to the Crusader to arrange the recovery of his vessel. He had been undaunted by the experience. He knew the sea could be very unpredictable, and said he would return to fishing as soon as he could, the very next day if possible. At this point the Crusader was still at anchor off Mataikona, its single anchor chain still holding, but the weather was showing no signs of calming down, and the Crusader was at the mercy of the seas. Just hours after Syme and Cunningham were taken off her decks, a large wave crashed over her, and she started taking on water. Hopes for saving her disappeared as the stricken vessel, which had endured so much over the past day, vanished beneath the turbulent sea. Right, that's basically me for the day, but of course I have to finish with a brilliant joke. This one is just as brilliant as all the others. Where do zombies go sailing? The Dead Sea. Brilliant. Right, so I'm going to be off for the next couple of weeks. If I were to continue with my Monday morning shows, I would be getting up slightly early on Boxing Day. And given the sort of food I'm expecting to eat during Christmas Day, I don't think getting up early is probably on the cards. So I'll be taking a couple of weeks. I will be returning on the 9th of January. And yes, in the meantime, have a brilliant Christmas, a fantastic New Year. Look after each other, and we will see you in the new year.